Welcome to the Classical Gabfest, a weekly discussion about the ever-changing world of classical music. I'm your host for this week, Tiffany Liu, and with me as always are Kensho Watanabe and William White. This week, it's our first ever Projects Special, wherein we'll look at some recent collaborations, research, and creative endeavors that we've been involved in. But first, we like to start with our prelude segment. So, Will, what do we have today?
Well, we have today our unofficial official intern, Joseph Vaz, so I think you all know what that means. Joey, tell the people what we're going to be playing.
This week we'll be playing a round of everyone's favorite game, Name That Tune, aka Stump the Hosts.
And now Free Zone presents Name That Tune.
Music games don't come any simpler and any more intimidating than Name That Tune. And for us, this game is especially fraught because none of the three of us know what we're about to hear. That's because these Name That Tune submissions come from you, our loyal listeners. We make no guarantee that we'll be able to identify precisely what these pieces are, but we hope that hearing our thought processes will elucidate something about how we listen to music and provide some entertaining musical banter. So that none of us can see the submissions, we've once again asked our unofficial official intern, Joey Vaz, back on the show to help us out. Welcome, Joey.
Good to be here.
All right, Joey, here we go. This is the listener's favorite, our most despised.
Womp womp.
Time for our first submission here.
Yes, let's get right into it with listener Christopher's submission.
I was getting some strong Christopher Theophanides vibes from that excerpt.
I knew one of us was going to end up saying that name.
Haven't we had Christopher Theophanides as a submission already on this show?
Yeah, and I think it might have been actually one of the other pieces that Christopher submitted.
Maybe this is Christopher Theophanides submitting his own piece.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, let's just talk about what we got. I mean, we got a full orchestra? Yeah, full orchestra.
Yeah, I would say full orchestra. I would say pretty lushly orchestrated.
Lush.
And I'm going to venture American. And in the last 50 years.
I agree with that assessment. I would say that it would not surprise me if this went a bit further back either. But my guess would be it's in that 50-year time frame.
I was really confused at the beginning when the brass entered. It almost sounded like organ, but maybe, am I wrong? Did you guys feel that way as well?
I didn't notice any organ in there. I mean, I definitely thought that this could be film music. Mm-hmm. Could not be, but it certainly could be.
You know who I think my guess is probably going to be like Howard Hanson.
Howard Hanson would be a great guess. Barber is what the guess that I wrote down.
It like had a sort of a texture that I might associate like rhythmically with like wind band writing a little bit. So I was, part of me was like, oh, like to Kelly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Hanson wrote some wind music too. Mm-hmm. I think that's a very solid guess. I mean, and if it's not American, the only other thing I thought there's a slight chance that it could be Soviet.
Oh yeah, we've been down this route before.
Yes, we
right?
have.
Where some of like the marchy Soviet stuff sounds quite American bandish.
Right, but this could be like an obscure movement from a Khachaturian ballet or something. Okay, so we like to spread out our guesses here. So Tiff is going with Howard Hanson, probably a symphony or something, right?
Sure. I mean, it did kind of remind me of one of the outer movements of the Second Symphony that we all know.
Yeah. I think that's a very good guess. Just to really cover the bases, I will go. I'll say Khachaturian, some very inner movement. Kensho, where are you? What are you going to say?
I think I'm all aboard the Theophanides train.
Oh, okay, nice.
I go with my gut.
All right, Joe. Do we get close at all here?
Not quite.
Oh,
This is the Sixth Symphony of Finnish composer Eino Juhani Rautavaara.
I see.
Really?
The fourth movement, entitled Apotheosis.
Okay, so we weren't close with any of our individual guesses, but if you combine our guesses into one, that is actually exactly
That could
what
be
it
said
would have
for
been.
every wrong guess that we've had on this game.
Well, I will say it for every wrong guess then.
All right, Ratavara. Very good.
Yeah, good play. Well played there.
Excellent pick.
Christopher, yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right. This is the second submission. This comes from listener Satish.
Listener Satish is continuing his run of extremely obscure
Violin
I
concerti.
wonder if these are all like from the same CD.
Oh yeah, who's the performer here? This sounds like chanson.
Oh, interesting. Chaconne. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, I mean, there are moments where it sounded more like chanson than others, and I know that there's a couple of like fairly long like things that are not the poem, but that are kind of like the poem for violin and orchestra. That it sort of reminds me of like this kind of stratospheric, a couple of romantic harmonies blended with like the extended chords that are kind of take it out of that territory. I mean, it's a little on the cheesy side even for her chanson, but I think it's like it lies in the same territory for me.
Well, I mean, to me, I thought that it sounded, had a little of that sound of like the Russian Spanish thing, like Rimsky or...
Well, I know I say this every time that we, get one of listener Satish's violin concerti, but, Respighi wrote these like hour-long...
yes, the famous Poema Autumnale, which I believe we've guessed
There's
every
a few,
time.
like there's a Gregoriano, and there's several. There's not just like Poema Autumnale.
Oh, interesting. I mean, the name that came to mind for me was Glazunov, and I know that this is not the Glazunov violin concerto.
No,
but maybe he has some other sort of poem for violin and orchestra. I'm just gonna go with that.
Shall we triangulate? Kensho, pick somebody. Wait, so we have Russia and we have France. You go with like German or Italian or Spanish.
Spanish maybe, but what is a Spanish?
I also wrote down Rodrigo. I mean, it didn't sound quite Spanish enough for Rodrigo, but it had that sort of orchestral flavor.
Sure, why not? Let's go with it.
All right, Joseph, are we? How far away are we on this one?
None of you said the composer's name, who is Samuel Coleridge Taylor, the English composer.
Oh, nice.
His violin concerto's second movement.
Yeah, I would never have gotten there. That's cool though.
Yeah, me neither. Well played, Satish. Very nice.
I'm not sure anyone's even like, getting anything from our elucidating our thought processes today.
No, what they're getting is excellent listening recommendations from our listeners themselves is really what this boils down to.
Yeah, that's true. All right.
Today's last submission comes from listener Tom. Here it is.
Okay, so Tiffany and I cannot answer this, right?
Yeah.
That's the rule on this one.
Why is that the rule?
Because you could have used this in a round of listening limbo for the two of us. And we would have both buzzed in the first. We would have probably both wagered about 3 seconds, and we would both have gotten it.
Yeah, but that means that we win. That's good. Come on, this is not. We take the win, guys.
Wait, so did you not recognize it, Will?
Oh, I definitely recognize it. Could I tell you exactly what it is?
Well, why don't we gain something from you elucidating your thought processes?
Okay, this is a virtuosic piece for solo violin and orchestra, a work of light music. I believe that this is music of Fritz Kreisler. Kreisler, the great violinist and virtuoso and sometimes composer. Am I correct about that, guys? No.
I don't. Did Kreisler write any concerti?
I don't think so, but it is a work of another virtuosic violinist. Though.
Is it Sarasate?
Nope.
That's closer, though.
Joachim?
Nope.
Auer.
Do I even know anything by Joachim? More famous as a composer.
Yeah.
More famous as a composer.
Specifically for violin repertoire.
Yeah, Paganini?
Okay, very close.
The nationality is a little wrong.
Well, but in the pantheon of like violinist composers, he's right next to Paganini.
Yeah,
I would say,
true.
right?
Yeah.
I'm
enjoying this game now.
It's amazing how the teamwork just flies right out the window.
Okay, little East European.
Yeah,
Eastern European. Wieniawski?
Yes.
Oh, okay. What is the piece? You'll have to tell me that.
This is the third movement of the second violin concerto.
Oh, this is from a concerto?
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's actually a
Interesting.
violin concerto, yeah.
Huh. Wow. All right. Well, we won that one.
Sure did.
Thank you for the freebie. That was
Thanks,
nice.
Tom.
Instantly lifted the dread of this game. Thank you.
All right, so we're 1 out of 3. Yay us! Yay me in particular, who had to actually suss that out. You know, really, I did the heavy lifting here because Kensho and Tiffany just sat back and showed how knowledgeable they are.
It was all for entertainment value.
All right, well, that just about does it for this week's game. But before we move on, we'd like to remind our listeners that these listener-generated Name That Tune rounds are a regular feature of our show, much beloved by you, the listeners, much dreaded by us. But as ever, we invite you to try to stump us by checking out our show notes, where you can find a link to the form where you will upload a 30-second identified piece of classical music for us to identify. And now we move on to the rest of our show, and as a special treat, young Joseph here is going to stay on with us for the entirety of the episode because he is involved in one of our projects that we're going to be talking about today. So now it's time to move on to our first project, which is a major collaboration that our own Kensho Watanabe took part in this past March. Kensho, would you like to tell us about the project that you were involved in?
Sure. This is definitely a project that kind of gave me life during the pandemic, especially creatively, let's say. So I had the privilege to be attached to a co-commission by the Met Opera, the Philadelphia Orchestra, and at the time of its inception, the Seattle Opera, on a new opera by American composer Kevin Putz, which is based on the book by Michael Cunningham. That was then made into a movie, and it is now becoming an opera. And so there's 3 levels of extraction there, or 2 levels of extraction, I guess. The opera is called, of course, The Hours. And one of the first steps of Kevin being able to hear the opera in its current state was a kind of a save from Opera Fusion, which is based in Cincinnati, and also the opera studio at the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music. And it was kind of a save by them to kind of allow us to have this workshop so that Kevin can hear the music for the first time, actually. So it was kind of a exciting event. You know, you always be there in a way, in the room in some way, when the composer gets to hear their first, the first time they get to hear live what they've written. So we had about 15 or so singers from CCM, along with 2 pianists, and I got to conduct all the workshop sessions. So the purpose of the workshop for this is obviously for the composer to hear everything. Also, the librettist Gregory Pierce was there. And so the 2 of them got to kind of hear for the first time and also make adjustments as we went along. We had about, 5 days or so of work, culminating in a live. We had 2 presentations, one for the Met staff. We kind of live streamed a run through of the entire opera as it stands, prior to a kind of a formal presentation that was live streamed for Opera Fusion donors and kind of subscribers. And so I think, Will, you tuned into that live stream. You were able to hear that.
I did. I enjoyed it very much, and it was really nicely produced. There were a lot of different camera angles. We got to see you conducting a fair amount. We got to see a lot of the singers. One thing that I noticed, and maybe something you could talk about, Kensho, is like this was a bad time for COVID. And the COVID physical infrastructure that was in place was pretty extreme. Like, you guys were separated by huge distances. Every singer was behind an enormous plexiglass window and masked and separated from each other. Can you talk about like how hard it was to do this workshop, like to actually do the work of the workshop under those conditions?
I mean, obviously it was challenging. Originally the workshop was scheduled for, I think, sometime in the fall, but because the COVID rate in that county in Cincinnati was too high for people to kind of gather in a room, we had to postpone it till March. So that was already the case. And then once we got in this room, there was this massive ballroom in Music Hall in Cincinnati. And basically the singers are arranged in the biggest semicircle I've ever seen in my life. And then I was kind of the center point of this semicircle. And so I had this kind of 180-degree panning of all the singers. What made it even more difficult was that some of the singers were but they were singing multiple roles. So I had to quickly, memorize who was playing one character, but also covering soprano 2 in the chorus and another small role. So I found myself keeping my head on a swivel in terms of trying to find people in this massive semicircle. But, one of the things that I'm just so impressed with the singers at CCM, I mean, they, knew these parts so well. And one of the funniest things was actually the first day Kevin was talking about the piece and describing the three leads. So if you know a little bit about The Hours, if you've seen the movie or read the book, it centers around 3 female characters that are living in different timelines. And when this goes up at the Met, the 3 leading ladies will be Renee Fleming, Joyce DiDonato, and Kelly O'Hara.
Oh, man.
So,
boy,
is that all?
Stacked. Yeah.
Big stars here, right? Yeah. And, we had really gifted singers, but also young singers. And Kevin just kind of dropped that on the first day, like, hey, like your parts are going to be sung by these like incredible singers and actors. And, they really rose to the challenge. I was just really impressed, knowing that it was going to be live streamed for the Met people and live streamed for an audience online, and being in less than ideal conditions acoustically and also just physically in terms of having a mask. I can't imagine singing opera with a mask in front of you. So a lot of kudos to them in being so prepared and also being so enthusiastic about the whole process.
Are these workshops for operas a common feature of how shows are put together? And if so, why only for operas and not for symphonic music, say?
I mean, I think that all compositions, I don't know, Will, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think all composers would love a workshop of any piece that they write, just to hear it live and get some feedback from people that perhaps they trust, or people that may have commissioned it, or something where there's a feedback system that's in place, that's in a safe place, that occurs in a safe place, let's say.
Absolutely. I wish that it were that way, but unfortunately it's not. And but it seems to me that these opera workshops are becoming a more and more common feature of how operas are created. And I think that that's a positive development. Yeah.
And of course, the things, we can work out some kinks that occur that, musically in terms of like timing, there is, especially in an opera where there's a pause that's kind of built into the music that may not come across when it's not on stage, so just allowing, just to see how long that pause should be for a stage action to occur. And if that's too long, or does it break up the flow, those kind of things we can talk about. We were talking about the ending of Act 1. There's, this climax that builds to the end of Act 1. And some of the discussion was, should the last note that's being held be a few bars longer, or is it too abrupt of an ending? And those are the kind of things that musically we were discussing. But then we also had Paul Cremo from the Metropolitan Opera, who's a dramaturg there, who was there strictly for the dramaturgy of the opera. So he was talking about, oh, like, does this make sense in terms of this character getting to this spot, his or her kind of psychosis or something like that. And we were talking, and so there's so many different elements to workshop. It's not just like, is this note or rhythm or, length or articulation or dynamics, is it what Kevin wanted? It's more about also the flow of the story, the narrative, the dramaturgy, all this stuff is going on. So certainly it was, there's a lot going on during this workshop.
I think we should listen to a little bit. Do you have a favorite selection from the live stream that I watched that we might be able to insert here?
Yeah, I think the last excerpt that we presented in that live stream is an aria sung by the character named Clarissa, who will be sung by Renee Fleming. And in this case, it was sung by a great soprano named Teresa Perrotta.
I have a thought about why, this is not typical for an orchestral landscape, which is that, like, the trust in the language that we use to convey things to orchestral musicians, and how, like, kind of, well, from one angle highly developed and from another angle kind of restrictive, just in terms of notation that you give. Orchestra musicians expect that if you put a piece of paper in front of them and they can understand everything, then they should be able to play what's on the page and the music should be able to stand. And this is simply not the case for opera because there are too many damn moving parts, right? I mean, like, but it's like saying that, like, oh, we should be able to, just give everybody their lines and film a movie and just tell people where to be. That's just not how it works. There's a years-long, usually $1 million process involved, and, like, by the time that you've just said, okay, well, we're not going to workshop this and we're just going to put it on the stage and see how it goes, you are several $1 million in the hole. Like, that's just not going to happen. So they have to have these kinds of infrastructures to safeguard the whole process, because otherwise you've wasted how many people's times? And if your 10-minute orchestral piece is kind of a dud, like, so what? Like, that's hard to say in a way, but I think that's just how that particular field works. So it's not that surprising to me that we don't have regular workshops for composer compositions for orchestra.
Yeah. Certainly the Met saved several $1 million by paying Kensho $1 million to run this workshop.
Yeah, that's how much you got, right?
Funny. But actually, Kensho, that does bring me to another question for you, which is just that when you introduced this project, you said that it was a bit of creative work for you, and I was wondering about that because, I mean, when we conduct let's even say an opera, of Puccini or Verdi, those guys aren't around. They're long dead. So, you're in charge. I mean, the conductor becomes in some way the embodiment of the author. You try to be true to the author's intention. I mean, that's one of our big goals. So I'm just wondering, what is your role in a situation like this where the purpose of the activity is for the composer and the librettist and the director to mold and shape their own work? Do you have a voice in that creative process, or are you really just trying to keep the wheels greased and make sure that everything technically is working as well as it can?
I think it really depends on the situation. I've been in a number of situations where my input is welcome, and other situations where my input is not. Luckily, in this case, Kevin and Greg were really open and really involved me in a lot of those discussions. Of course, you also need to read the room as a conductor and also not intrude on their own process. But if ever there was a suggestion that I had about whether it was timing or, I'm also kind of the, it's funny because, you would think, composers come in and, with the composers there, obviously they are the authority on the music. But my goal in my preparation is to kind of know the piece better than the composer themselves, where you know more of the intricacies. And also because this was a workshop in which the singers were there, but the orchestra is not, right? So we had two pianists playing an orchestral reduction of the piece. So my role in a way is also to imagine what the orchestration could be, or have that discussion with Kevin in terms of, oh, this might work, or, oh, like I would find myself asking Kevin, like, oh, what are you thinking about orchestration here because of balance or chorus text or whatever, those kind of small details, like, will those things work in that kind of orchestral context? So I was more of like the imagining the scenario in terms of the orchestral sound.
So we'll call you like the orchestral consultant.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's good. And what was fun for me was, what I love about opera so much, and especially you mentioned Puccini, Will, and Puccini is so wonderful at not having clear just beginnings and ends of scenes. Like everything kind of bleeds into another. And this is kind of the same line that Kevin is working with. And so it's the most satisfying thing as a conductor when you can get those seams to be so elegantly, tied together. And when it's the first time anyone is laying their hands on it, that's even more satisfying to kind of figure it out for yourself in terms of the strategy of getting from point A to point B with, of course, the advice of the composer, which is a lot of fun to kind of have that discussion.
Is there going to be another one? Like, what's the next?
So next planned thing, if I am not mistaken, is that we're going to have a staging workshop, which will presumably be at the Met next January.
And you're on for that as well?
I will be going to conduct the staging stuff. And then in between that and the actual performance, the Philadelphia Orchestra is going to do a concert version of the piece, which has not been announced yet. So that's all I'm going to say about that.
Cool.
I won't conduct that, though.
Okay. Darn.
I'll be around for that.
Okay.
Very cool. Well, thanks for talking about that, Kensho. And we look forward to the continuing developments of that. And hopefully some of our listeners will be able to get to the Philadelphia Orchestra, or to the Met, or wherever it pops up next, and check it out. I think that now it's time to talk about Tiffany's project. And this is something that I've been wanting to include on the podcast for actually since the beginning. This is on like the first list of potential topic ideas.
And I've been putting it off.
Well, so we're going to talk about Tiffany's doctoral dissertation. Tiffany actually has a doctorate in conducting.
Yeah, so you guys can address me as doctor from now on. Thank you very much.
Dr. Lou, I'm more than happy to
No,
that.
actually, please
exactly.
don't do that.
I think we alluded to that on the podcast.
I know.
when
I was
your
trying to be cheeky, but I actually really don't want that.
Anyway, so Tiffany, tell us, give us the elevator pitch for your thesis, because it's a very interesting concept.
Yeah, which is about, it's funny because now revisiting, I earned my doctorate degree in 2019, and so it has been, just about 2 years. I've been getting the, kind of the Facebook, like, oh, this is what happened 2 years ago, and it's like pictures of me, like, at the graduation wearing my tam. So it's kind of revisiting all of that has been kind of interesting this week as I've been preparing for this segment. But let's just do, again, just the elevator pitch, which is that I started from the point of view that when people come into collegiate orchestras where they are expecting to earn a music degree and enter the field afterwards. And my observation of a large slice of that student body, particularly in their freshman and sophomore years, was that they would come in with like 3 or 4 years of youth orchestra experience and be jumping into a music degree, and they're in a college orchestra, which, the first concert might be, I don't know, Beethoven's 7 plus like some really hard overture plus some, you land in orchestra, both feet on the ground, and you're sight reading really hard stuff. And it strikes me that this is a kind of roundabout way to teach them towards orchestral principles. And so the title of the dissertation is Orchestral Playing Through a Principled Approach, by which I mean to say, it doesn't make sense to teach people how to bow something or how to play orchestral dynamics or how to vibrate by dint of going through a kind of random mixture of repertoire, whatever happens to be in their freshman year or sophomore year or even junior or senior year. By the end of your 4 years in an undergraduate college orchestra, you have collected these programs, and what have you learned? Well, you've learned how to play those pieces. So the idea is, how do you learn principles that are associated with orchestras? So there are a couple of the obvious questions that will come up, like, oh, well, there's orchestral excerpts class. That's where you learn the stuff that you will need to take to auditions. But I'm not thinking about auditions. I'm thinking about how do you participate in an orchestra in a way where you are taking principles and applying them to repertoire, rather than taking your past experiences from whatever random slice of repertoire that you happen to play and then applying them to new repertoire where it doesn't really work. So I don't know if that makes sense, but what I constructed as my doctoral project was several what I'll call modules that are themed by principle. So I have orchestral dynamics and several excerpts from the repertoire that are meant to represent a sort of systematic presentation of the types of orchestral dynamics that can appear in the repertoire, and all the kinds of nuances that might appear in that. And then there's a module about vibrato and the kinds of vibrato that you might need to use and the diversity. So rather than having a conductor tell you at some random point in some Brahms symphony, I want constant vibrato, and then all of a sudden you're doing constant romantic Germanic vibrato in Prokofiev, you have a better sense of, oh, this is a kind of context where a narrow vibrato or even senza vibrato might be more useful. So it's just trying to present a little bit more of a holistic approach to these principles rather than just one-off collections of concert programs, which is what people normally get in their orchestral undergrad experience.
Before we continue to probe the ideas in your thesis, Joey, I actually want to ask you something. You have now 2 degrees in piano performance. Is there any sense in which this kind of a principled approach to music topics makes its way into the teaching of the piano literature, or is it the same thing as with orchestra? You just play sort of what your teacher wants you to play or what you want to play, and then you just learn what you can learn from playing those pieces?
I think that it does end up being very similar to the current approach to orchestral learning, in that we are always learning repertoire for a performance or an application or a competition. Maybe a difference would be that in the one-on-one setting that piano lessons are, unlike the conductor to full symphonic orchestra setting, a lot more generalizations and tangents and all sorts of things that make it into a more holistic learning environment are easier.
Yeah, and I do mention this in the dissertation as a point of contrast between private instruction and ensemble instruction, which is a fundamentally, you can't compare the two. But I was trying to take some cues from, the specificity and dedication of private instruction and try to work those into orchestra. Because the fundamental hard thing about instructing orchestra is that everybody's at a different place and you're trying to address all 100 people in the room at the same time. I mean, that applies no matter what context, but especially problematic in educational contexts. And so if we can find a way to sort of teach things in the room that actually everyone kind of needs to know, that are structured in a way that very closely mirrors what a responsible private instructor will do, which is not to just throw a piece at you and say, your goal is to learn how to play these notes at this time. The other thing I will say is that, as we've been talking about things that are not necessarily geared towards a specific performance, the idea of these modules, right, was that I constructed them such that an orchestral director of a collegiate orchestra would be able to incorporate them, either in part or in whole, into the normal orchestral rehearsal cycle in such a way. Maybe at a point early on in the year where, your grad students are kind of still moving into the area, but your freshmen and sophomores have landed. Maybe you can do half a module for half a rehearsal for them, just to set them up right and give them an idea of here is some context and not just here is the piece that we are playing.
Yeah, I mean, I love that this is done. You obviously focus on the strings, because in my experience, actually, I'm not sure. I mean, I can only speak of my own experience. I'm not sure if other educational institutions do this, but at Curtis, there is a brass class and also a wind class that is kind of act as kind of the supplemental things that are in addition to the orchestral requirements in the class, where there's usually a rotation of wind teachers that go in and work on orchestral playing. So they're
basically doing this, but for those sections. I'd love to see the rep list for that.
There was a time at Curtis where Norman Carroll, the former concertmaster of the Philadelphia Orchestra, would run string sectionals in that manner of really taking, obviously, the top cream of the crop string instrumentalists that come to Curtis and really teach them not the techniques of how to play your instrument, but the techniques of how to play an orchestra. Because like you say, Tiffany, in your dissertation, those are completely different skill sets that somehow, it's, you also mentioned this in your paper, where that's not necessarily the responsibility of the private teacher as well. It's almost like the Venn diagram circles just don't overlap there, right?
Yes.
Where there's just this missing skill set that can only be taught in orchestra. But that setting, like you say, in terms of one person trying to teach 70 to 80 students is just
fundamentally
you're
flawed,
just
right?
not going to get the message across as strongly as a one-on-one session or a smaller group setting.
It's just like so many years of watching freshmen especially come in from their, like wide-eyed youth orchestra, like, I've played maybe, 10 orchestral programs in my life. And then sitting down at the back of the section and like what evening their way through Debussy La Mer,
Yeah.
I mean, let's just even take Debussy La Mer for a second, and like just the kind of tremolo that you use at the beginning of that is like a specific kind of tremolo. It's not just random fast notes. Which
Explain really quickly what tremolo is for our listeners.
tremolo is when we have it's a string technique in which a note has an unspecified number of repetitions inside, an unmeasured number of repetitions inside a given value. And what will happen to attain it is that the player will draw their bow very rapidly with very, very small strokes so that you can't quite hear necessarily like a rhythm inside what the separate strokes are, but you can hear that a note is kind of being sustained, and it is a usually used to achieve a sort of misty effect. And I do talk about this in the tremolo. I actually do dedicate about half a module to specific tremolos, and one of them, and which also gets used in Debussy, this kind of zingy tremolo where you sting the beginning of it and then use like this kind of wide, not frantic, but kind of, impassioned tremolo, which people don't get. People think tremolo means as fast as possible within whatever note value that you're given, and it's not
Right, it
true.
really just means unmeasured.
It really just means unmeasured, and so that has a very broad number of possibilities that never gets talked about in a holistic way. It's just like, oh, can we have that tremolo faster there? And then what have you learned? You've learned that that place right there needs to have faster tremolo.
I'm wondering something, and that's about this last year. Because of the difficulty or impossibility in many cases of performances at many schools, I know that at my school this last year, for example, CCM, they split all players who wanted to play in an in-person orchestra into one orchestra that did have kind of live-streamed no audience performances, and then another one which they were calling the reading orchestra, I believe. And I imagine that there are a lot of institutions that did a similar kind of thing around the country or around the world. I'm wondering if we'll see, in a couple of years, more integration of that kind of methodology into a typical orchestra.
When people started migrating to the online performance live stream thing, like I'm not in a position at my current job to sort of implement this in any way whatsoever. I mean, my orchestra has a completely different mission, but I was just sitting there thinking like, oh my God, like this would be such a timely addition to the curriculum to not have to work towards preparing performances for what? I mean, who is tuning in to watch live stream performances? Okay, no offense to anyone who has done live stream performances, including all of us, but would it not have been such a great use of the time to say, okay, like this whole semester, we are looking at modules about themes and we're going to play excerpts together. We are going to learn, I can't even remember now which modules I included. Of course, there was only, I had planned for a whole suite of like 12 modules. And of course, I eventually ended up paring that down to, I think, 5. But it was meant to be a long-term project that I was, wanting to add to. Anyway, dynamics, and then pizzicato. Who teaches pizzicato? And bow distribution, which is a big deal in orchestra in a way that is totally different from solo repertoire, right? What if you had just taken that whole semester, that COVID semester, and just taught towards those things instead of, trying to figure out a way of how to get the sync licenses from publishing companies for your performance of blah, 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 blah.
I mean, I think the challenge will be to kind of convince those in the just educational administration to accept the fact that it is okay to not perform, because I think also the performances
they generate wider goodwill, right, in an administrative and very important public sense.
And to be even maybe perhaps a little bit cynical, it is the product that they're selling to get more prospective students to apply to, right? So when you take away
Okay,
that
so I mean, I do have an
brand or
argument
product-
against this.
Yeah,
which
I'm
is,
playing devil's advocate.
Yeah,
here.
I know.
I'm with you.
And I'm gonna thank you. And you're right. And actually, it's not the objection that I anticipated. But I'll get to that in just a second. But the product that you're selling your students is not concerts, it's freaking education.
Here we go.
And again, I'm actually not suggesting replacing the orchestral repertoire or the orchestral concert cycle with this stuff. I mean, that's not what I'm about either. I'm just noticing patterns, like deficiencies in particularly undergraduate, underclassmen, music majors education that can be very easily addressed by a simple half an hour tutorial on what different kinds of orchestral tremolo is. Like it just seems to me that there's a faster way to do this, rather than every time you get to that place in Brahms 4 where the first violins, or where the violins need to do da 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 ya da da di, to have to explain to them what meno forte means and what a proper sostenuto is and what a where to change your bow, where to be in your bow. I mean, it's just like not that. It's just not this hard, But how much time do you think we collectively have spent rehearsing that one passage for those things and the same things every time?
Yeah, what I love about this, Tiffany, is that most doctoral theses are like head in the clouds, working on some tiny area of research or some deeply theoretical thing. Your approach here is very practical. It is about saving time. It's about improving the quality of education. It's giving conductors a very concrete repertoire and rubric to follow to do it. So I really do commend you. I mean, I've been following this, your process of creating this thesis since you were working on it, and we talked about a lot of this as you were working on it. So I found it very interesting.
Well, thanks for, I mean, it was Will, this is funny because we're about to get into Will's project, and when Will sent us the raw material to listen to, he said, "Sorry to make you guys listen to half an hour of a composition of mine." And here I am thinking, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry to send a 100-page paper to y'all to review." But I appreciate you guys talking through all of it with me, because it was a passion project, and I was very happy to kind of revisit, and I hope it has a future, frankly. So get at me if you want to see it or want to talk about it with me.
Hear, hear.
Thank you, Tiffany. This was super interesting and really actually facilitated a good discussion on orchestral educational repertoire or orchestral
the
program,
education of
designing
orchestral musicians, or
there we go. Yeah.
Whatever I said in my title.
Whatever the title is.
That's exactly the part you spend the most time finessing.
All right. So last but certainly not least, we'll turn it over to Will and Joey for our last segment.
Yeah, so for my project here, we've got young Joseph with us because he is an integral part of this. Basically, the long and short of it is, I composed a piano sonata for Joseph. And just to do a little bit of background here for our newer listeners, I met Joseph when he was a student in my youth orchestra, the youth orchestra that I used to conduct, the Cincinnati Symphony Youth Orchestra.
Oh, no wonder you can't stop calling him young Joseph.
Yeah, well, come on. He's viewed from my perch as an ancient elder. Everybody seems young, Tiffany. So Joseph was a student in this youth orchestra as a bass player. And I found out over the 3 years that he was in the orchestra that he was really a pianist. I mean, he was a great bass player, but he used to hang out with these dorky kids, and during all of the breaks, they would go over to the piano and they would play Chopsticks or Heart and Soul or something, and Joseph would do these virtuoso variations on it. Hey, and by the way, these kids probably would have been too cool to be my friends when I was in high school. So, I'm calling them dorky, but whatever. Anyway, so it turned out that Joseph was an amazing pianist. He would then play the piano parts, when we were doing an orchestral piece with piano in it, like the Three-Cornered Hat, or what were some of the other ones that you played, Joey?
Some of Prokofiev, Romeo and Juliet.
Juliet.
Schnittke, of course.
Yeah,
oh,
of course.
I'm so sorry.
So anyway, Joseph is then one of these students who went on to study music, and there are some of these students that you keep in touch with, especially the ones I think who go into music, and develop a relationship with. And gosh, I want to say it was, Joseph, after you had graduated college and as you were going into your master's in piano performance that we started talking about the idea of my writing something for you.
I think it was in that first year of my master's.
The first year of your master's.
During the spring of which the pandemic hit.
Right. So I had sort of cleared aside some time to write a piece for you. And then as soon as the writing was on the wall about the pandemic and it was like, you're not escaping your house, you're not going to be working, it was like, okay, I'm just going to start writing music. So yeah, Joey, what am I missing in the backdrop here?
I think the most important part of the backdrop that you didn't mention was prior to the pandemic and in preparation for your writing of this piece, we had a long email and phone back and forth about various piano sonatas and other genres of piano solo music that I enjoyed, that I felt the technical aspects of which were interesting, and vice versa, what you thought was interesting, what you liked, what inspired you in what was to become your sonata.
That is crucial here, is that Joey gave me a crash course in the history of the piano sonata, basically. And yeah, I would listen to like all of the Prokofiev sonatas and all the Scriabin sonatas and write you back detailed commentary or cursory commentary, really, let's be honest.
Okay, so maybe we won't get the full crash course, but like, what's the crash course? Like, where do you start, at the end of this long lineage of piano sonatas? What are the takeaways and where did you start?
As with most things like this, my takeaways were principally what I did not like, which I think is an important thing for a composer, because like you want to add something. You want to add your own spin on this centuries-old repertoire. So if you see a lot of stuff that you're like, well, I don't like that, that point helps you pinpoint on what you can bring to this genre. And I mean, what I didn't like, I think, was, especially in the 20th century repertoire, a lack of tunefulness and melody was something that I found disconcerting.
All right, John Borgslap.
An over-reliance on pianistic technique and effect rather than musical content, And it's not to say that like the sonatas of Prokofiev lack in musical content, but they lack in a musical content that speaks to me by relying so much on the pianistic virtuosity. And that's something that I cannot really bring to this from a player's perspective. I am not a trained pianist. I think that I produce a pretty virtuosic piece. I mean, like to the point where I listened to Joseph's performance of this, and I'm like, how do you do that? Like, cool. I just wrote those notes.
How do you do the thing that I wrote in my own piece?
Well, may all composers be blessed with performers that are able to make that happen, right?
Amen. Yeah. This is a first for me.
Yeah.
This is a first for me of having somebody who is a true virtuoso put their full talents and abilities to the service of something that I have written for them. I've had good performances in my pieces before, but nothing like this. Nothing where when I've listened to Joseph's performance of this piece a number of times in the past few days. He just recorded it this past week. And I sit there and listen to it sometimes and I think like, oh, I'm listening to Joseph's sonata that I just happen to know and like. I mean, it sounds so authentic, just like he just tosses it off his fingers. It's like he's making it up. And I'm like, wow, this is cool. How did he come up with that? So it's something that like Kensho was talking about. Like, as a performer, one of your goals is to know the piece almost better than the composer. And my God, did Joseph do that in this situation? It blows my mind.
Should we hear a clip?
Yeah. Joseph, do you have a clip that we should you would prefer?
No, it should be up to you.
I'll throw in one of the really juicy virtuoso clips where it sounds like there's two people playing the piano at the same time and it's really just you.
Okay. I was going to say, speaking of the crash course takeaway being what you didn't like, a lot of what I first offered up to you was music that really spoke to me, and you didn't like it very much. So I was surprised when you gave me something like a final product of the piece, and I was able to relate to it on an emotional level so tightly, which I hope is what speaks in the performance and why you say that it sounds like a piece by me or something like that you're listening to. Because I was a little bit expecting, after going through all of this 20th century piano sonata repertoire, that you were going to do something completely different than all of my favorite music, which is true in some ways and not in others.
Like what? Like, what is a characteristic of this sonata that you feel like applies but doesn't necessarily apply as well to the things that you had suggested or anything like that?
The tunefulness of the sonata, which you were mentioning earlier, is certainly present, but not in the way that anyone from Scarlatti, Mozart, Beethoven to Schumann, etc. Their piano
It's true.
sonatas.
They're not really hummable tunes.
Yeah,
in this case,
exactly, exactly. They're very not hummable because there's a lot of large leaps in the melody.
Well, I was going to ask because sometimes when composers write for specific instrumentalists or virtuosos, there'll be things that are tailored to that performer's strong suits. Like, I don't know if you guys talked about, like, I'm thinking of that that Igor Desmond and Jew skit. Rachmaninoff had really big hands. You know that skit. So it's like Joey. Like, let's say Joey had huge hands. So like you can do like Franck style, like big chords or something. Was there something like that where there was a certain technique that Joey wanted to kind of maybe highlight in the piece that you guys talked about?
It's funny you ask that because it's very tempting for me to sort of backfill in some story like that, where I would say like, oh, I mean, the reason that he sounds so great doing this is because I custom tailored the piece for him, and it's so perfect.
That doesn't
and
sound like you at
why.
all.
Yeah, no, I would be happy to say that, but that would be giving me way too much credit, honestly. I think that the one thing that Joey told me actually about his hand span, I ignored, and there's like one part where he actually can't get the two notes at the same time. What I would say is, look, I have followed Joseph's career. I've watched the live streams of his recitals, in college and grad school and stuff like that. I've heard his recordings as he's applied for various competitions and auditions and stuff. And my takeaway, I think, was just, this guy can do anything. So I'm just going to write whatever I want to write. So rather than saying that like I created the perfect glove for his hand, it's like he exercised his hand in such a way that it would fit the glove that I made perfectly. I mean, there's probably a better metaphor out there, but
I think we can attribute it to a subconscious learning of my playing over the years. Probably
there's probably that, and then there's also probably a bit of, for total lack of a better word, grooming involved here, which is that when Joseph was in the Cincinnati Symphony Youth Orchestra, I wrote a huge symphony for the youth orchestra. And so Joey has been inculcated into my musical language and voice since he was, quite a young man.
Prior to being young Joseph. Younger Joseph.
Tiny Joseph.
So I think that might be some of it too, is just that he's known my musical style for a while. And in a lot of ways, this sonata is a development of many things in that symphony. What do you think about that, Joseph? Am I onto a thesis here?
I absolutely agree, because I just listened to that symphony again for the first time in many years anyway, the other day. And it absolutely struck me that this piano sonata is a logical evolution of your musical style. As for the quote-unquote grooming bit, not only was it that experience with you as my director in CSYO, but ever since you've been a musical mentor to me, just by emailing me, by me reading your blog posts or listening to your music, by being subscribed to your YouTube page. It just simply is true that you're among my top X number of musical influences. So I'm sure that did not hurt the process either.
Oh,
Joseph, I wasn't fishing, but I like what I caught.
let's talk about the actual piece for a little bit. Do either of you have favorite moments or movements, or like, was there a passage, Will, that you kind of had to finesse for a long time before it felt right, or like what was the?
Yeah, my favorite parts of this have changed a little bit, and I think that the Joseph is the fourth it's the fourth variation that's like the slow kind of moody Mussorgsky like one with the in the bass is the melody.
Yes.
Yeah, I like that one an awful lot.
My favorite parts of the piece are the outer sections of the second movement, what is named the second movement, which is in an overall A-B-A form. It's a much slower section than most of the first and the third movements, and the introduction for that matter. The material for the whole piece is basically all laid out in the introduction of the whole piece. And it's the main theme, we could say, is a very wide-ranging tune melody with very large leaps, I should say, not wide-ranging. And in the second movement, some of these large leaps at a slower tempo become to me more understandable all of a sudden. So the build-up of this musical motif that occurs in the introduction and the first movement is released. That tension is released somehow in the second movement for me. I suddenly see the beauty in the material that I've already been hearing. And also, speaking about finesse, which we were earlier, these were also the sections that I had to get the most coaching, I guess, from Will about, because it's just very hard in slow music sometimes to get the timing and tensions of the composer without talking to them. And I found it beautiful from the very first way that I played it all the way to the way that I ended up playing it with coaching. And I think that means that it is really a special part of the piece to me.
I always say that any successful composition should have something that embarrasses its composer slightly.
Oh?
Yeah, I think it should, because I think that you should reveal a little bit something about yourself more than what you might feel comfortable with. There should be some part of a composition that shows like a childhood enthusiasm or a bit of crassness, a bit of bad taste that you reveal about yourself.
Some cheese.
Yeah, some cheese. Exactly. And so there are some moments in the last movement here that are just like rocking out. And so those are the slightly embarrassing things. And Joseph just like plays them. He makes it so much fun to listen to. It's great.
I want to ask one more thing, Will. As someone that has heard some of your music, I'm certainly not a Will White expert. The harmonic language in this was more intense and fraught with some, I don't know, anxiety or darkness than I've ever heard in your music. So I'm just wondering if that was something that is true, that is something you were trying, or where did that come from?
In other words, are you okay?
I'm definitely not asking that. I would never ask Will that.
Yeah, I mean, there are very dark moments in this piece. But really, I think this piece was just about exploring range more than anything else. And once again, it's because I knew, you asked about, like, did I write this for Joseph's technique? And in a way, I said, like, I just wrote it for the freedom that his technical prowess allowed me, on a technical level. But I also know that he was an amazing musician. I mean, I've heard him play like the gamut from A to Z of like lots of different repertoire. And I've heard him play other new pieces as well. This is not the first piece that has been written for Joseph. And the compositions that have been written for him are very impressive by very excellent young composers. I mean, his peers. And so in a way, I guess that was another way in which I felt freedom to explore the wide range of his musicianship as well, and the wide range of the musicality. And honestly, like, especially having heard him play it now, it does, like, I'm reconsidering a lot of my pre-held notions about like music and the potential of genres. Because if you had asked me before, I would have said the symphony is the grand genre, nothing can beat it. The orchestra is the greatest tool at the composer's disposal. But now I'm like, wait a second. Like, I've never had a piece come off like this before. Because if you find the right interpreter and they bring their full apparatus to bear on it, and they have total control of their fingers and their sweep of the keyboard, and the piano has such power, such immense power as an instrument, there's something much more direct about that than the symphony, where you're trying to cajole 100 people into creating this unified product. And like, look, I mean, I listened back to, I too, Joseph, listened to my symphony that you guys played. And it's like, okay, yeah, I mean, it's a youth orchestra. I would like to get a better performance, a better rendition of that. But I don't know, like what's the final potential, of having an orchestra play your work where you're trying to coalesce so much into one unified vision versus having one person just lay down the vision. I mean, if you get one really understanding performer, there's something very valuable in that. So I don't know. Jury's out. I think there's advantages and disadvantages.
I mean, I have a sort of blueprint game that I play with myself on the radio sometimes when I hear a piece that is not for an orchestra, which is to ask myself, would this be better if it were for an orchestra? And I'll try and like construct it in my head. And I've come to hear like that huge chunk. I mean, most, I would say, of the piano repertoire that actually makes it onto the radio is better on the piano. It's just as like the piano is the instrument. So
piano's great. That's my takeaway here. Piano, thumbs up.
Good takeaways on the Classical Gabfest. Well, thanks for giving us that amazing insight into this very cool project. We'll link the piece, of course, in the show notes, and hope all of you enjoy listening to it because it's quite compelling. Let's go to Kensho to wrap our episode up with our classical mixtape. Kensho?
In our classical mixtape, we each recommend some music that's caught our ear this week to share with our listeners. So, back at you, Tiffany. What do you have this week?
Well, as I mentioned in last week's episode, I was back to conducting this previous weekend with an all-string program with a former community orchestra of mine, which I enjoyed very, very much, thanks to members of the Wilmington Community Orchestra for last weekend. Here's a piece that I would have liked to put on the program. I think I eliminated it mostly because I thought it would be a little bit on the more complex side with the program that I ended up with, but it's a Glazunov string orchestra piece called Theme and Variations for String Orchestra, also in G minor, Opus 97.
So, Tiffany, here's a question for you. Anything in here that could serve usefully in a module on teaching a string orchestra technique?
Yeah, vibrato, right? Like Russian romantic vibrato.
Cool. Thank you, Tiffany. Joey, what do you have for us this week?
I'm bringing to the mixtape a piano work by Ed Bland, a composer and arranger who was equally at home in jazz and classical styles. He himself described his written compositions, as opposed to his jazz arrangements and film and TV scores, as a blend of European classical music, African American musics, and West African drumming. I'm lucky to have known him personally through my family, and he was also an early musical inspiration for me. This piece is the first of 3 Chaconnes in blue for solo piano. The harmonic pattern from which the whole piece is built is a very soulful figure. It sounds straight from traditional black gospel music. And over the course of 5 minutes, it kind of devolves into free, atonal, improvisational music, and then slowly re-emerges by the end into the original harmonic statement.
Cool. Thank you, Joey. Will, what do you have?
Well, I'm also going to recommend some piano music. This is music by the great Claude Debussy from his Images, Book 1, Reflets dans l'eau, and it is performed by a certain Joseph Vaz.
Better on piano than orchestra.
No question. Yes, exactly.
Because I referenced the hours in many of its states in my project, here is the main track to Philip Glass's soundtrack to the movie The Hours.
Phil Glass must have so much money. It's just ridiculous. You know?
And listeners, if you want to check out the rest of the soundtrack to The Hours, don't worry, all of them sound the same. You'll find the links to all these and to our full classical mixtape playlist in the show notes.
And with that, it's time to wrap up this episode of the Classical Gabfest. I'm Tiffany Liu, and on behalf of Joseph Vaz, Kensho Watanabe, and William White, I'd like to thank you so much for listening and to encourage you to subscribe and rate us on Apple Podcasts. We'd also love your help spreading the word about the show on social media, where you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can reach us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com, and we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, happy listening, and we'll be with you next week.